Hello again. Today I'll be covering the CyberArk SIA Linux SSH use case. My name is Brad McDowell and I'm a Principal Technical Trainer here in Australia. Today's objectives are, we'll look at applying the right level of privilege controls for the right identity at the right time, and we'll compare how that looks between PSM, PSMP, and of course SIA. We'll then review the architecture of PSM, PSMP, and of course, more importantly, SIA and how they compare. We'll then get into the detail of how we set up SIA. We'll look at the connector install, pools, networks, and of course the general settings. You can of course use SIA to connect to targets using Vaulted credentials. We'll demonstrate that. Then we'll look at how we can deploy the SIA certification authority to our targets, and then we'll create recurring access policies so that we can apply just-in-time access controls for SIA-SSH use cases. In the lab, I'll keep the just-in-time controls to any time of any day, but you can of course change this as required. Then we'll look at how we can understand how the SSH fingerprinting works within the platform, and of course we'll do the same with the SSH certificate authority. And then finally, we will review the SIA auditing capabilities. CyberArk's mission is about applying the right level of privilege controls for the right identity at the right time. If you want to read this slide in detail, please pause the video now. But first, we'll cover off two key concepts. If we think about PSM and PSMP, these products fit into the standing access area. Whereas when we think about SIA, this product fits across standing access, just-in-time access, and zero standing privilege. In today's video, I'll be covering in detail how we can apply just-in-time access through recurring access policies for Linux SSH. And now with that said, I'll go through the architecture differences between PSM, PSMP, and most importantly, SIA, and how you can improve the level of privilege access controls for those use cases. Here is an example architecture diagram of a PSM implementation. If we think about PSM SSH, the user will typically log on to the Privilege Cloud portal, and there'll be a Vaulted credential they might have access to. There are two ways they can typically use a Vaulted credential using PSM. The first way is the HTML5 gateway. The HTML5 gateway will connect to the connector using the SIA connector, and this will connect the HTML5 gateway to the load balancer. The load balancer will then make a connection to a PSM server. In this case, it could be the same connector server. And then the connector server, or PSM, will then launch a PuTTY session and connect to the target. The second way the user can access their credential using PSM is that they simply hit the connect button, and that will download an RDP file back to the user's machine. The user will then open that RDP file, and that will connect them on to the load balancer here. The load balancer will then make a decision on which PSM server the user needs to be sent to. In this case, it will be connector server 1. So the PSM server will open up a PuTTY application and present that back to the user, and then of course connect to the target. And here is an example architecture diagram for a PSMP or PSM for SSH implementation. This process works slightly different to PSM. For both of the connection strings that I've just put on the screen, they'll use their favorite SSH client and connect to the load balancer. The load balancer will then make a decision on which PSMP server should be used. So in this case, it will be this one here. And then the PSMP will grab the credentials of the Vaulted account that we talked about earlier, and then use those credentials to connect to the target machine. And now let's look at the example architecture for an SIA implementation when we connect using SSH. So as you can see already, there is no load balancer, so straight away the implementation is much simpler, and the deployment of SIA is a simple process when we compare it to deploying PSM or PSMP. So the way it works, depending on what you're trying to access, the connection string will look like this if you're connecting to a Vaulted credential, and you'll notice in this connection string, it will have the username present of the target account they want to have access to. So of course, they'll use this connection string, and this will point them directly at the SIA service. The SIA service will then get the Vaulted credential of that user that is in that string, and then of course connect them to the SIA connector, which will then SSH them onto the target local admin in that case. So that's using vaulted credentials. So I'll just clean up the screen a little bit. You can of course reduce risk in this workflow. We can do this by setting up some just-in-time, or JIT, policies within the recurring access policies in SIA. For this to work, administrators must deploy a script to each of the servers, and what this does, it installs a certificate to each of the targets. I'll show you this later on in the video. What happens next, the user will connect to the target using a string that looks like this on the screen. You'll notice that there's no username for the target in this string. So the way it works is a user will use their favorite SSH client and connect to the SIA service over here. The SIA service will then determine, based upon that string and the just-in-time or recurring access policies, and what the user has access to. The SIA platform will then create a temporary SSH key, and the user can't see this SSH key, but what's happening in the background is this key will be only valid for the duration of the just-in-time policy. So this might be 2 hours, it might be 1 hour, depending on what you configure. And depending on what the configuration is in the recurring access policy, you'll be connected to the identity of what's in the policy. So this could be local admin, or it could be local read-only, and I'll demonstrate this later in the video. And at the conclusion of the session, we did use an SSH key over here. Whilst the user can't see this, there's no need to rotate passwords after the session's completed. This SSH key will be only valid for the duration of the recurring access policy, so this will automatically clean itself away and not be useful for anymore. So this means we're reducing risk and providing the right level of controls for the right identities. Next, I'll show you a short demonstration of how the PSM and PSM workflows work. You're welcome to skip over that if you're familiar with them. And then I'll get into the detail of how we can set up the SIA use cases. So here we are in the lab. I've logged into Privilege Cloud as John, and John's got access to these 2 Linux accounts that I've onboarded offline. What I'd like to do first is share how John could connect to this target using the legacy PSM and PSMP methods. So first we'll touch on the PSM methods. So in this environment, if we hit the connect button, this will default to the in-browser mode for PSM. We'll connect. And the user's connected. This allows a user to interact with the target within the web browser tab, as you can see here. So I'm done with this session. I'll type in exit to disconnect. And I'll connect to the same target again by clicking on the same button, but this time we'll turn off the in-browser mode. This will still mean we're connecting to the target via the Windows PSM, but instead of loading in a HTML5 browser tab, it'll launch in its own separate RDP session. And the user can interact accordingly here. So I'll just disconnect from that. Next, I'll share with you how the user can connect to this target using PSMP, or PSM for SSH. We'll open up a Windows terminal here, and we'll use this connection string to connect to the same target using the CyberArk PSMP, or PSM for SSH. I'll connect to this, we'll put in the user's password, and in this environment, I am using TOTP. So I'll press number 2 here to enter the code manually. I've entered the code, and the PSM for SSH has connected me to the target. I'll disconnect from this now, and I'll just clear the screen. The second way the user can connect to the target using PSM for SSH is using the PSM for SSH MFA caching. I'll just click on that here. So what the user can do, they can type in a passphrase and generate a temporary SSH key. The user will download this key. I'll just save that into my downloads directory. And if we go back to Windows Terminal, we can run the same command with the -i and then the location of the SSH key in the downloads directory. So the string will look like this. When they connect, all they have to do is provide the passphrase for the temporary SSH key, and the system will connect to the target. I've entered that now. And the user's connected to the target using PSM for SSH. I'll just disconnect and I'll clear the screen. So our main goal in this video is to improve this and provide modern connection methods using CyberArk SIA. To configure this, we'll need to log into Privilege Cloud as an administrator. I've already got that prepared in a separate tab over here. And once you're logged in as an administrator, we'll go to the application switcher here and go to the administration space here. I'll open that in a new tab. And in here, we'll expand out my environment, go to connector management, expand out connectors, and we'll click on SIA connectors. In a previous video, we set up these connectors. In this environment, I've got 2 Windows SIA connectors and 2 Linux connectors. To add a connector is very easy. Come up here to add a connector and follow your way through this wizard to add a connector. At the end, you'll be given a script to run either on the Windows connector or the Linux connector, depending on what your use case is. So I've already done that in this lab. You'll notice that these connectors are all attached to this connector pool name here. If we go to connector pools is a way of defining how the system knows what's available at those connectors. And what we've done in this lab is provided this wildcard domain name so that it will always go to this connector pool to find targets in this domain name. You can create simplified names for networks. In this environment, I'm using the same name for the connector pool, but you can get creative with network names to assign them to connector pools. Next, we'll review the SIA settings. We'll switch over to the Secure Infrastructure Access service here. We'll open that in a new tab, and we'll come down to settings here. So in a moment, I'll share with you how you can connect to a target using vaulted credentials using the SIA service, and you can enable or disable that feature here. If you turn this off for SSH, it means the only way that users can connect to targets is through recurring access policies, which I'll show you later in the video. But for now, we'll leave this turned on. Further down here, we've got MFA caching for SSH. We've got that turned on. If you've got it turned on, the SSH key that the user downloads is valid for 60 minutes, and you can adjust that to the time period, as you can see there. With the MFA caching, you can enforce the source IP enforcement. So this is the public IP address that the user is coming from. And of course, that is turned on here as well. And there's some settings here around duration and idle session limits, and you can adjust those accordingly. And one thing we did in the last video, you should ensure that the SSH recording is turned on so you can make use of the audit features in CyberArk. And the last option here is the SSH host key validation. Again, later in the video, I'll share with you how you can manage the SSH host keys. I'll now switch back to John's session, and we'll open up the secure access space. So now that we've loaded the secure access page as John will be able to see any vaulted credentials that he's got access to automatically. And furthermore, in the current lab environment, we don't need to do any further administration changes to allow John to be able to use the SIA service to connect to targets using vaulted credentials. I'll demonstrate that now by copying the full connection command here and switching over to Windows PowerShell and pasting that in here. John will be asked for MFA, so we'll provide our password. And of course, in this case, John's got the one-time password client set up. So we'll press 1 to use that feature, and we'll enter in our code. And we're connected to the target. So this was the string that John used to connect to the target, and I'll just disconnect now, and I'll clear the screen. We can also make this authentication process easier for John. If I switch back to the secure access portal here and go to this target we got here, you can click on the 3 dots here and open the connection guide. So instead of MFAing every time we connect using that string I just demonstrated with, we can click on token here and expand this out, and we can download the token. I'll just save that in my downloads directory for now. And if we go back to Windows Terminal, we can go to the previous command here and type in -i and look for the downloads directory and SSH key .pem file. Once we connect to that, there's no further MFA required. And just like that, the user's on the target with the SSH key. I'll just disconnect from this now, and I'll clear the screen. So that was 2 methods on how a user could connect to an SSH target using vaulted credentials with SIA. Next, I'll show you the configuration changes required to allow users to connect to SSH targets using recurring access policies. We'll just switch over to the administration session now, And before we go and set up policies, we need to look into resource management here. So we'll click on this and we'll expand out section B here of the Linux configuration. By default, the SSH host key validation is turned on. I'll create a situation where this will be a problem later in the video. But the important part here is that we need to get the SSH certification authority onto all our target Linux devices. You can do this by clicking on Get Script. And what this script does is installs the SSH CA public key on the target device. We'll copy this to the clipboard. And I'll simply apply this by connecting to the same target we're on before. And we'll use the SIA service because this is a vault of credentials to log on as an administrator. And the SSH key is still valid, so this will work. And we're connected to the target. You don't have to use SIA to connect to the target to install the SSH key. This is just my method of getting onto that server. And then we simply paste the script here. And just like that, the CA certificate has been installed and the SSHD configuration has been changed. So you need to run this script on all servers. On purpose, I'm only running this on server 1 and not server 2, so I can demonstrate what would happen if you didn't run this script. There are, of course, other ways you could push out this CA certificate, depending on your tooling in your environment, but for now, we'll just use the script method. I'll just disconnect and clear the screen. I'll switch back to the administrator session and we'll close this. And we'll head over to recurring access policies. What we'll do now is we'll create a policy of VMs and we'll give it a name. We can of course define a time frame. I'll leave that as always. And in the assets here, I've got the on-premise. So I'll click add on that. And we'll type in our server name and I'll add a second one of Lin server 2 with the same suffix. I'll hit apply on that. So this means I'm only allowed to connect to these two servers within this policy. I'll now create an access rule and we'll call this local admin and we'll expand out Linux here. And there are a number of suggestions here that you could use. You could allow the user into the root user directly or use these variables. So if your target machines were connected to an LDAP system or Active Directory, you could use the variable of the username or the username at domain name or SAM account name. In this demonstration, I won't use any of these options. I'll just put the user into the local admin user. And next we'll add members. You could define groups or roles or whatever method you want. I'm just going to define an individual user of John. Next you can define your access window. I'm going to select all day, but you could define certain times of the week or days of the week. And here's the session duration settings that you can modify if required. I'll create that now. And I'll activate this policy. So if we go back to John's session, and I'll just cancel out of this. Before we had the vaulted credentials of connecting, I'm going to add a target here, define Linux, and put in the address of Lin server 1 that we've got here. I'll just add that target. And as you can see here, we've got that one there, and you can tell this isn't a vaulted credential because it doesn't have a platform ID or a username. I'll just add another target and we'll do Lin server 2 just so we have it here as well. So we have both of them. So like before, I can copy this full connection command, go back to John's session, and I'll use the same SSH key that we had before in the downloads directory. So what this means is when we connect as this string here, we're not defining a username. The policy will define what username will be thrown into based on the recurring access policy. So I'll connect using this. And just like that, we're thrown into the user of local admin at that same target. I'll exit out of here now and I'll clear the screen. And I'll run the same command and we'll try and connect to server 2. So I'm expecting this connection string to fail, and that's because we haven't installed the certificate on the second server yet. So we'll try and connect. And here's the error we're expecting. The SIA service couldn't authenticate because it doesn't have the certificate authority allowed on that server. I'll just clear the screen. And what we'll do, we'll fix it by using the vaulted credential connection string. And so we'll change this to server 2. So we're going to log in as local admin to server 2 because John has access to that vaulted credential. And this SSH key is still valid. So the SIA service should connect to server 2. Very good. We'll head back to the administrator session. We'll go to the resource management. We'll go to all environments again and we'll copy and we'll get the script and copy it and run it on server 2. And that's installed successfully. So I'll exit out of this server and clear the screen. And now we should be able to use this connection string without defining the username, of course, to server 2. And so I'll connect again. And of course, we're thrown into the local admin user as per the policy. So now we've got SIA working on both targets. I'll just disconnect and clear the screen. Next, I'll show you what will happen if you've got two overlapping policies for the same target. And you might do this because you might have an admin user and a low-level read-only user. So offline I've created a user on both the targets called local read-only. So we'll switch back to the admin session here. Just close this. We'll go to recurring access policies and I'll create another policy, VMs. We'll call it Linux dash and then local read-only. Keep the time frame as always. We'll hit add here on the on-premises. So I've defined both the targets here. We'll hit apply. I'll now create an access rule. I'll give it a name. We'll select Linux here. And like before, I don't want to select any of these options right now. I want to define this user here. I'll add in a member of John. And this could be a different set of users, but what I'm trying to create here is a situation where John has access to two policies at the same target. I'll just make this time frame all day and the same settings here. So I'll create this policy and activate it. So if I go back to John's session, and right now I'll connect to Linux server 1 again using the same SSH key as before. So now John is presented with two options, and that's because John has access to two policies that are overlapping on the same targets. So the SIA service doesn't know which user to place John into, and that's why John's presented with this question. So we'll select 2 for local read-only and hit enter. And now John has access to the local read-only user. So I'll exit out of here and I'll clear the screen. Next, I'll demonstrate what will happen if the SSH key fingerprint has changed. This might happen if you've replaced a server or made configuration changes that change the SSH key fingerprint. I'll connect on to server 1 again as local admin. And we'll run these commands here to overwrite the SSH fingerprints. So as you can see, all the fingerprints have been rotated. So I'll disconnect now. I'll clear the screen and we'll connect to the same target again. Again, I'll try and log in as local admin. And as you can see here, we're unable to connect because the remote host key has changed and it returned a different value. And it's suggesting some possibilities of what might have caused this. It might be a third party is attempting a man-in-the-middle attack, or the host key has changed. It might be because of a server upgrade or someone's replaced the server. So I'll show you how you can fix this via the session diagnostics. So if we come back to here and go to session diagnostics, we can see this failed session here. If we scroll down in here, we'll go to this here. It'll give us some information here on what happened. And if we go to the error details, we can scroll down in here and click on this link here. And it will give us some information here. But the main thing I wanted to share here is we can delete the fingerprint that SIA had saved previously. So I'll click on delete fingerprint and we'll delete that. We'll close this and we'll head back to the Windows terminal. I'll clear the screen and we'll reconnect to the same target again. And this time it should connect because it will refresh the token because it hasn't saved it in the database. So we'll connect as local admin. And there we are, we're connected. So that's what you might do if your SSH key fingerprints have changed. Just exit out of there, clear the screen. I'll head back to the administration session. And what I'll do next is show you how you can rotate the SSH certification authority. If we expand out this section here, we can see our previous CA key versions and which ones are inactive and which ones are active. What I'll do now is I'll generate a new certification authority key. And we'll press continue here. And we can see both versions active here, version 2 and version 3. What I'll do next is download the public key of the CA key. When you click on this link, it will download the latest version of whatever keys you've got here. So I'll click on this and I'll just open this up and we'll edit this file. So I'll copy all of this here. I'll just minimize this and we'll head back to the Windows terminal and I'll connect onto server 1 as local admin, and I'll cd into the etc SSH folder. And if we list out the directory here, we need to update this file here. So I'll just do a sudo nano SIA and we'll press Ctrl K to remove that line and paste in our clipboard. Hit Ctrl X to quit and Y to save the changes. I'll just disconnect and clear the screen. And I'll switch back to this portal here and we'll deactivate version 2 here. And I wanted to do this to prove that I'm using version 3 of the CA. So if I go back to the Windows PowerShell, we'll connect onto server 1 again as local admin. As you can see, we're connected. So everything is working as expected. And I'll clear the screen. So of course, as you know, that worked on server 1 because we updated the key, but on server 2, it won't work. So if I try and connect to the server 2, this server hasn't had its key updated. And if we try and connect as local admin, option 1 here, we'll get an error, and that's because it's unable to authenticate with that key. So let's say in a real world environment, you might have thought you pushed out that CA to all your servers and you've missed one. You can come back to the portal here and reactivate a previous key. We've done that, so we'll come back to the session here, or Windows terminal. I'll just clear the screen and we'll connect to server 2 again. This time it should connect. So now that we're connected, we'll use nano to update the SIA public CA file. So when we come into here, we can press Ctrl K, paste in our clipboard to update it to version 3 of the CA key. I'll hit Ctrl X to quit and Y to save this. And if I exit out of here and we'll clear the screen, and we'll head back to the administration portal and we'll deactivate the CA key that we don't need anymore. So that's deactivated. I'll just prove that we can still log on to server 2 and we'll use option 1. And this proves that the CA version 3 of the key is now working. Before we disconnect, I want to touch on some of the auditing that happens with SIA. So let's do a couple of activities to generate some logs. So I'll run this command to do the update and upgrade. And we'll go and view a file, let's say. I just wanted to view this file to share with you what the script does when it adds the trusted user CA keys. So that's how it knows to look at this key. I just wanted to view a file to see what would show up in the audit trail. So we'll just hit Ctrl X and let's exit out of this server and clear the screen. And if we head back to the administrator session here, and we'll switch to the server selector here, and we'll go to the audit. I'll just open that in a new tab. So an auditor can come to session monitoring, and we can review all the sessions that have happened. Now, straight away we can see a risk score here and some details about the session, so I can click into this. So the user will be able to see a lot of information here, all the commands that were run. We can also play a recording of what happened. So if we open this up, we can jump to sections of the recording depending on what we want to see. So the auditor can jump around to different sections of the session. I'll just close this here. And finally, we can come to the AI summary here and click on Generate AI Summary. And this will give a brief summary to the auditor of what happened in that session. And I'll end the video here. Thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next video.